Carol Leonnig, take us through your stunning reporting, which broke at 6:58. And I had a feeling of, oh, missed it by 58 minutes, but I'm so excited to get to talk to you today.
I wish we had been about 2 days earlier, honestly. So 58 minutes, that would have been happy for that. Nicole, it was a lot of work. I want to clap out my great colleagues at the Post. The team was essential to breaking this story, but, let's focus on what the story is. Many prosecutors have said to me in the wake of our story, well, yeah, I thought he was a subject of the investigation, but now we know, indeed, he is the former president of the United States is a subject of a criminal investigation that is looking at 2 tracks and possibly 4 different possible crimes. That includes investigating the possibility that Trump and his allies engaged in seditious conspiracy to obstruct a government proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government, also a series, sort of a grab bag of fraud in which they could have used the Department of Justice to try to block that proceeding, but also to try to use the Department of Justice and other levers of the government to defraud the American public, to push a criminal agreement that involved pushing a big lie and trying to overturn the results of the election. The other thing we learned was that, and this was the startling thing to me, was that the Justice Department had obtained the phone records of senior and junior aides in the Trump White House, to include Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff, and that those records were obtained in late April. While the January 6th committee was chugging along and doing some amazing work, but before the January 6th committee began its hearings.
That's amazing. Carol, we tried to piece together a timeline of our own, because that nugget about Mark Meadows' phone records is so interesting in terms of the timeline for when the Justice Department decided not to prosecute him the way they have Steve Bannon. Let me just put that up and go through some of this with you. In January, DOJ confirmed an investigation into the fake electors. In April, Ali Alexander says he received a DOJ subpoena. At the end of April, DOJ first starts requesting the transcripts. First time we find out that they've asked for transcripts from the Select Committee. Also in April, they received the phone records of Trump officials, which includes Mark Meadows, we know from your incredible reporting. Then June 3rd, DOJ declines to prosecute Meadows for contempt. Do you think that they were, on another track by then with Meadows? Is that a fair assumption, Carol?
Nicole, I have to say that I can't say with certainty. I'm so glad, by the way. I love a timeline, and we've made some similar ones. So you and I are on the same track with that regard. In that regard, I don't like to say what I don't know, and I don't know if the access to his call data records related in any way to deciding not to prosecute. My sense is, from talking to sources and also just informed prosecutors and former prosecutors who worked in some of those offices, that the decision with regard to Meadows was really one of how close he was to Donald Trump, what a senior official he was in terms of the privilege of the executive to get the counsel, the unadulterated, unabridged, and unmitigated advice of your senior aides. The president has that right, and that the decision not to prosecute him had to do with that bond that's allowed between a president and the senior most officials. The one who's the most important, of course, is the National Security Advisor, but a White House chief of staff has got to rank number 2 in the privilege hierarchy.
So, Carol, back to then, though, what DOJ and a criminal probe would be doing with his phone records. I mean, that is the more intriguing part of what you're reporting about Meadows. And I only ask about declining to prosecute because it was such a sore spot for the committee. They publicly criticized that decision. But, of course, no one knew until your story broke that Trump was very much the subject of the criminal investigation, the questioning. Can you talk about the kinds of questions that have been put to witnesses about Trump?
Yes. So one of the sort of icing on the cake for this story, if you will, was great reporting by my colleagues about the kinds of questions that were being asked in the grand jury. And the kinds of questions were stunningly focused on Trump. For example, in the case of Mark Short and Greg Jacob, the questions hovered repeatedly around: what did Trump ask his lawyer to do? What did you hear Trump say? Then what was Trump's reaction when you or the vice president said that's not legal? These kinds of questions over and over again, like a water drill. And the amount of time focused on that would be, no big deal if a reporter was asking a ton of questions about what did Trump say, what did he do. It would be a bigger deal if an FBI agent kept asking a witness those kinds of questions. Mr. Short, Mr. Jacob, please tell me about the president. But when a prosecutor asks those questions in a grand jury, and almost, up to 75% of the questions are about that, that's a rough estimate, by the way. This is a prosecutor who's preparing for prosecution, who's preparing for trial. This is not a fishing expedition when you ask questions on the record in a grand jury. And what you are seeking to do most typically is get information on the record that's going to be valuable to you in bringing an indictment. I'm not saying the former president is going to be indicted. I'm saying the venue is important, and the fact that Donald Trump's actions were such a central piece is important, very important. It's not the only piece of information, by the way, that led us to report that Donald Trump is a subject of the investigation.
Neal Katyal, we are all now dangerous backseat legal experts after watching Donald Trump sort of Houdini his way out of at least, I think, 3 or 4 criminal probes. But one thing I learned from reading Volume 2 of the Mueller report is there is an act and there is the evidence that proves the corrupt intention to commit that crime. And if you read, not between the lines, but the lines of Carol's reporting, the 75% of questions about what Donald Trump said and did and whether he was in the room for the things that his lawyer said and did seem to be squarely around the acts and the intent. How do you read Carol's reporting?
I think it's Carol's reporting, and hats off to her and everyone else on that team. It's hugely significant. The former president appears to be part of a criminal investigation by a grand jury. And federal grand juries are always criminal, Nicole. So they are fact-finding bodies that decide whether someone should be criminally prosecuted. Having said that, there are 2, I think, important caveats. Carol just got to one. There's a distinction between an investigation and an indictment. The indictment is the formal bringing of charges. That comes later, only after the grand jury's looked at all the evidence. Nothing like that's happened yet. At the same point, I think this is one of the rare times in American history, if ever, that a federal grand jury is looking at a former president and his conduct. The closest I know of is Richard Nixon, who was in 1975 interviewed by a grand jury for 2 days, but he had already been pardoned for that very crime, Watergate. So he wasn't facing criminal liability. Here, Donald Trump arguably is. Now, the second distinction, which I don't think Carol got into, is the distinction between the subject and the target of a grand jury investigation. So a subject is someone who is within the scope of the federal investigation, but that person has material information or something like that. They could also ultimately become a target, that is, someone who there's substantial evidence that the prosecution believes has committed a crime. But right now, the reporting, and Carol, as a precise reporter, is reporting it this way, that it's only about the subject. They haven't made a decision to go after Donald Trump yet. They're asking a lot of questions, and both today and yesterday, I think, Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, you've gone a little further than the story. Yesterday on Lawrence, you said the questioning was dominated by Trump, at least with respect to one of the Pence aides, and today it sounded like you're saying that it occupied several hours and the like. That all suggests to me, that target is definitely a possibility here. It's not just that they're trying to get background information, but they're really trying to understand what did Donald Trump do and when did he do it.